if even a bacteria or a self-respecting bug isn't interested in them, then you know that these things are poisonous to an advanced creature like us. You hear about it nearly every day on social media. There are books written about it, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. But what the heck is an ultra-processed food, and where did that term come from? Well, it actually started by researchers in Brazil in 2014, who were concerned that primarily Brazilians were eating a lot of foods that didn't exist 1 or 2 generations before. And the amounting research about how much a food is broken down from its original components and made to, quite frankly, maybe easier and tastier to eat was concerning. So the Brazilian ultra-processed food index was developed. And I think it's so important that I want to actually read you what constitutes an unprocessed food, minimally processed, processed, and then ultra-processed is. And I think it's a great starting point. Number 1, so scale 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. In other words, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, fresh legumes, fresh eggs, nuts. Basically, nothing was done to them except cook them. Second level, processed culinary ingredients. Cooking ingredients like salt, like butter, like sugar, like oils. That's processed culinary ingredients. 3, processed foods. In other words, canned fruits and vegetables, or processed meats. Then, ultra-processed food and drink products. So ultra-processed means, well, you didn't just take that fruit, chop it up, put it in a can and preserved it. You actually took, let's just say, wheat, took off the hull, took off all the soluble fiber, turned it into a white powder. Or you took a glass of milk, took the whey protein out of it or the casein protein out of it, dried it out, powdered it into a fine powder, broke it down into its individual amino acids, and then reconstituted it into something that looks like nothing that could possibly resemble a piece of steak or even a piece of cheese, but has those components in it without all the good stuff. So the more you kind of break down a natural food into its individual components, throw away the good stuff, and then remake it into a tasty product that usually uses oils like hydrogenated oils and usually has to have preservatives to make it not go rancid or bad. That's how an ultra-processed food comes about. I like the story. We lost our home in Santa Barbara 7 years ago to the mudslides and lost all of our furnishings and possessions. And we were lucky after a year to find another house that my wife actually likes better. But it came fully furnished, which was great for us because we had no furniture. And it was so furnished that it, in the kitchen, had 2 large glass jars, one of which contained beautifully arranged Oreo cookies, and the other glass jar had beautifully arranged large pretzels. Now, for fun, I have left those jars there. And it's now 7-year anniversary of the mudslide. And those Oreo cookies, an ultra-processed food, those pretzels, an ultra-processed food, look identical to 7 years ago. They have not shrunk. They have not changed. No mold, insect, bacteria has any interest in them. They are perfectly preserved. And that's what you don't want to put in your mouth. Because if even a bacteria or a self-respecting bug isn't interested in them, then you know that these things are poisonous to an advanced creature like us. And in fact, Brazilian researchers have published the results of eating ultra-processed foods and processed foods on the human diet. For instance, a study published in November of 2022 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine concluded that these foods contributed to about 10% of deaths among people 30 to 69 years in Brazil in 2019. And a published study in Neurology in 2022 showed that a 10% increase in ultra-processed food consumption raises the risk of dementia, just a 10% increase in ultra-processed foods. So, as I mentioned before, one of the issues with most ultra-processed foods is they add oils to, among other things, stabilize the texture. But as anyone hopefully knows, most oils, when exposed to air, go rancid. They literally oxidize. And it's the oxidation that's the dangerous part of these oils. So scientists have two ways around it. The easiest way is to partially hydrogenate the oil. That means basically putting a chemical hydrogen bond in several places in the oil. A totally hydrogenated oil is solid at room temperature. A non-hydrogenated oil is liquid at room temperature. So adding some hydrogen bonds can stabilize the oil, so it quite honestly takes a longer time to go rancid. The problem with that is really changing the basic character of how that oil behaves. And our body is constantly using oils as fats in the membranes of our cells, in the membranes of our mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles in all of our cells. And it's kind of looks like what they need. It's not quite the same, so it's using kind of bad material as a building block. And the problem is those oils don't flex properly. Looks like what they need, they'll use it because that's all they have to work with, but you end up with a rickety, damaged building. Now, how vegetable oils came about is fascinating in itself, and I've written about it. There's plenty of YouTube videos about it from me. They literally started out as soap, not food. And if you like the idea of eating soap, then go for it. So just remember that these oils and processed foods, even though they sound natural, even though they sound like, oh, they're from plants, buyer beware. There's a stipulation that you cannot have trans fats in ultra-processed foods anymore. The problem is there's a loophole. If the trans fats are less than a gram per serving, then you don't have to list it and you can say 0 trans fats. So many clever companies continue to produce these partially hydrogenated food products. They have trans fats, but the serving size now is low enough that they don't have to put trans fats on the label, even though they're there. So please, buyer beware. Another big issue in the ultra-processed food world is that these foods in general have been stripped of all the dietary fiber. Because quite frankly, we associate fiber with not tasting very good, with not having a consistency that we like. The sad thing is, dietary fiber is what our healthy bacteria, which I call our gut buddies, actually have to have, not only to survive, but they also take those foods and they produce hormones like GLP-1 agonists that tell your brain that they are happy, they've been well fed, and that you don't have to go looking for anything else to eat. Probably the most impressive experiment that I know of to prove the gut-centric concept of hunger is a Chinese study where they asked volunteers to go on a 7 to 14-day water fast, where they ate nothing but water. Half of the group were given 100 calories a day of prebiotic fiber. Now, spoiler alert, we cannot absorb prebiotic fiber. We cannot digest prebiotic fiber. Only bacteria can use prebiotic fiber. So, no, they weren't given 100 calories of food. They were given 100 calories of food that could only be used by their gut buddies. And lo and behold, the group that went on a water fast without the prebiotic fiber, you guessed it, were really hungry. The group that got only 100 calories of prebiotic fiber a day had absolutely no hunger for 14 days. So what does that tell you? That hunger that you experience, that hunger that all these GLP-1 products bait, would normally be produced by your gut microbiome getting what they wanted to eat. And the bad news is, ever since the advent of processed and ultra-processed foods, which is a modern thing, they're starving to death. And isn't it interesting that the more ultra-processed foods you eat, the hungrier you get, because they're literally saying, what the heck? I hear you chewing up there, but nothing's coming down the line to me. Go find some more food. As I teach my patients about artificial sweeteners, the same thing happens with your tongue. Your tongue doesn't have any sugar receptors. It has sweet receptors. Back in the old days, the only time you tasted something sweet was fruit or honey. That was it. That contained sugar. When you tasted something sweet, you sent messages to your brain that, guess what? Sugar is on the way. Make some insulin to handle it. The brain calls down to the pancreas, sugar is on the way. When sugar doesn't arrive to the brain says, what the heck? I know sugar was on the way. You got cheated because I didn't get any. Go get some more. And that's why when I was 70 pounds overweight, despite exercising a whole lot and eating, quote, healthy, I drank 8 Diet Cokes a day. Like I joke, if they could sterilize Diet Coke, I'd have one during heart surgery. But I was constantly being told by my brain that I wasn't getting the good stuff and go find some more. So that's why I was constantly hungry. And that's why when you eat constantly ultra-processed foods, you want more because your gut buddies and your brain says, I didn't get any. So what are the worst offenders out there? Some of them might surprise you. Believe it or not, deli meats, those kinds you get at the delicatessen. In 2015, deli meats were classified as carcinogenic. Now, most of them, unfortunately, are made from beef or pork, and these contain that nasty sugar molecule called nu-5GC. Plus, they have nitrates, they're loaded with sodium, usually a lot of sugar. Now, on the other hand, if you can actually find a traditionally fermented sausage, that's totally different than what you're going to find at the deli counter. In fact, my good friend, James Beard Award-winning chef Jimmy Schmidt, has recently introduced nu-5GC safely removed beef in forms of ground beef, in brisket, in sausages, and in hot dogs. And I have no relationship economically with this company, but I'm a huge fan of jrranchfoods.com. Fruit juice. Well, fruit juice is an ultra-processed food. I joke that we could take a trip to the San Diego Zoo and look in all the cages and we will not find a juicer. Juicing removes all the prebiotic fiber Animals eat whole fruit, and they eat it whole. A gorilla is not having a fruit smoothie, which has been processed. You have broken down all of the things that your digestion was supposed to do. Just last week, the new pandas were introduced to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. And they showed this cute panda casually munching on a whole apple. They didn't give the panda a juice sippy cup of apple juice. They wouldn't be that stupid. And yet that's what we do every day with ultra-processed fruit juices or fruit smoothies. Granola bars. They claim to be made with nuts, seeds, etc. But most of them have at least 15 grams of sugar per bar, sometimes up to 50 grams of sugar. That's more sugar than a giant candy bar. Electrolyte drinks, like for instance, some of the Gatorades, have sugar, like 34 grams of sugar in a bottle. You can drink Element instead. Plant-based meat replacements. These are ultra-processed foods. Just look at the label. These have been plant materials that have been broken down and then reassembled. The very definition of ultra-processed. Yet because they look and have the texture of what we like a burger, these are passed off as plant-based and natural. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is an ultimate ultra-processed food. There is a plant-based food that I actually do recommend, certain cuts of a product called Quorn, Quorn, and I have no relationship, uses mycelium, basically mushroom roots, to build meat-based products. And I have my patients on them. They are not vegan because they have a little bit of egg white as a binder, but they really will work well as a not so processed food. Well, what can you do? Well, first of all, if you're looking at an ingredient list, the odds are it's already an ultra-processed food. There isn't an ingredient list on a head of broccoli. There isn't an ingredient list on a wild-caught shrimp. There isn't an ingredient list on a head of lettuce. If there's an ingredient list, it's in one way or another processed. Now remember, the terms all natural and healthy mean absolutely nothing. Even organic isn't always organic. The federal government allows 15% of the product in an organic label to be non-organic, and it still qualifies as organic. Huh? How does that happen? Food companies spend an average of $7.5 billion a year on advertising ultra-processed foods to us. Why do they spend that much money? Guess what? Advertising works. Just ask any pharmaceutical company. Don't be fooled. Finally, researchers at Northwestern University have created a tool for comparing packaged foods in the same category in order to figure out which one is the least amounting processing. For instance, let me just read this off. In the yogurt category, one plain organic yogurt scored a 4 out of 100. Now, while We Petite by Yoplait received a maximally processed score of 100. They're both yogurts. Now, I would stay away from both these yogurts because they have casein A1, but that's a different story. The lowest score wins, the highest score loses. And if you don't like those scores, the Brazilian score, which is available online, really helps you understand what's not processed, what's minimally processed, what's processed, and what's ultra-processed. The farther you stay away from ultra-processed and go back down to what your great-great-grandparents ate, the better off we're all going to be. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Dr. Gundry podcast. Make sure to check out the next one here.
Energizing, antioxidant, good for you. They almost all follow the same damaging pattern.